Dear Federal Minister Svenja Schulze, dear Vice Presidents Hampe and Brodotz, dear Master of Public Policy students, dear guests and colleagues. My name is Lena Kiesewetter. I'm the Managing Director of the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, and it is my pleasure to open the Brandt Lecture 2024. The interest in maintaining peace or eliminating hunger requires no further justification. But the interest in common survival must also be linked with the overriding issues of energy and the environment, with the risk of self-destruction. Willy Brandt wrote this 44 years ago in his introduction to the North-South report, addressing international development issues and global inequality. Today, I would guess that at least 95% of you in this room agree to this and would not even dream to question the relevance of environmental protection. So 44 years later, we've moved on. We've internalized the importance of climate action. And still, the global community failed to take decisive action. 44 years later, we understand and in fact already witness that the degradation of our living conditions does not only mean more hunger and poorer health. It also increases the risk of direct armed conflict, not in many areas of the world, but eventually everywhere. So I dare say that Willy Brandt would be an eager listener at today's Brandt Lecture on the prevention of hot conflicts. At the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, we train young professionals from all over the world in policy analysis, ethics, leadership, in topics such as conflict studies, development, energy policies, social entrepreneurship. Our students develop projects for social impact and consult external clients already during their studies. And they leave the school as purpose-driven leaders that go into public service, international organizations, consultancies, and civil society. Here, they shape public policy, navigate crises, and drive meaningful change. They tackle the policy challenges that lie ahead of all of us. And once a year, we invite them, our alumni, our entire community, and a broader public to do what smart leaders should do, to listen. Our venue for this is the Brandt Lecture, which is meant to give us the big picture on current global problems and to offer ways how to address them. So it's a special delight that you, Federal Minister Schulze, will be holding this year's Brandt Lecture. Your policy portfolio, economic cooperation and development, is not only close to our hearts and research, it is very much where the future of global society will be shaped. So I warmly welcome you to the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt, and now hand over to the university's Vice President for Research, Professor Brodotz, who will introduce you to the audience.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear friends and members of the Brandt School, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome you, Minister Schulze, to the University of Erfurt today. I think at the latest since 2018, Mrs. Schulze is well known to politically interested citizens in Germany. She was then Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. And it was also Angela Merkel's last term in office. Well, but I think that was surely just a coincidence of history. But I think it was definitely no coincidence that in 2021 she became a minister again in the current federal government. She's now responsible, as Lena said, for economic cooperation and development. The Federal Republic of Germany has had a separate ministry for this since 1961. By this way, the first development minister was not Willy Brandt, but Walter Scheel. Maybe, as is well known, Walter Scheel later became the fourth federal president of Germany. So, Mrs. Schulze, you can see where your journey can end. Well, every journey has a beginning, you know, and your journey began in academia. Mrs. Schulze studied political science in Bochum in the early 1990s. At that time, the University of Erfurt had just been re-established after being closed 180 years earlier. By then, the university had been in existence for over 400 years. This is because our university was first founded in 1389. This makes it one of the oldest and youngest universities in Germany at the same time. So, dear students, you see, you are well prepared for contradictions when you study here at our university. But contradictions are also part of everyday politics. Contradictions can lead to conflicts. Contradictions and conflicts can lead to war. And just a few weeks ago, Mrs. Schulze was in the Ukraine, a country that has been under attack from Russia for more than 2 years. A country that Germany's government is supporting with weapons, but that's not all. The German government is also providing the Ukraine with medical aid. For example, when Mrs. Schulze was in the Ukraine, she opened a medical center to help provide better care for the war wounded. So, contradictions are also a means of dealing with conflicts and remaining able to act in conflicts. Today, dear Minister Schulze, you will talk to us about human security in times of climate change, and we are very interested in what contradictions you see here and what conflicts are at risk in the future, and last but not least, how we can prevent them today. Thank you very much for joining us today, and this stage is yours. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, students, I will start with a question. Have you ever seen a lemming, those small rodents? They are related to mice, who regularly set off their thousands to find a new place to live. They are known for one thing in particular. People say they have a collective death wish, and they descend in droves down from the Scandinavian mountains to the sea, where they jump in from and drown. It is a type of self-destructive behavior that goes against any natural instinct for survival. And yet, as Willy Brandt pointed out in 1985, lemmings are not alone in that behavior. Humans are doing much the same. And with their destructive treatment of nature and the environment, they are releasing forces that will lead to the suicide of the human species. It is nearly 40 years since Brandt issued that warning. It was quoted again in the beginning, and yet it remains as relevant today as ever. Climate change is threatening life on Earth. Temperatures are rising, glaciers melting, and whole stretches of land disappeared under the sea. It is robbing people of their means of survival, and it is humans that have caused that change in the climate, although a small number of humans have done much more damage than most. As with so many issues, Brandt's ideas were ahead of his time. Certainly, scientists were already predicting many of the trends we are seeing today back in the 80s, but the general public still did not see the destruction of our environment and its negative impacts on our climate as one of the major challenges needing to be tackled. It would be interesting for me what you think. Maybe you can raise your hand. Which of you would agree that climate change is one of the biggest challenges facing humankind? One of the biggest challenges? Okay. And how many of you see climate change as the biggest challenge of the time? Oh, okay. I would say a lot of you. That's a vast majority. So our audience today is made up of students from the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy and guests with a strong interest in the issue. So you are probably fairly progressive thinkers. And yet, I think I can safely say there is a consensus in society that climate change needs to be tackled urgently. And I'm not just talking about Germany's society, I'm talking about worldwide. Elizabeth Watuti, the Kenyan environmental activist, asked in the run-up to the 2020 climate COP whether people in the industrialized countries have failed to realize how serious the situation is. And Marina Silva, Brazil's environment minister, is equally clear when she talks about why her country is taking such decisive action to halt deforestation. And we cannot accept 1 degree more than 1.5 degrees, she has said. That is a plea to other countries to really double down on the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and for them to finally do more to addressing rising temperature, limiting the increase to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level. So what is my starting point today in this? Is this: we, as the international community and as humanity, need an ambitious climate policy. We need it to preserve the natural resources that sustain our lives, but it is about even more than that. It is also a question of social justice, peace policy, and more international cooperation. I would like to illustrate that by putting forward 3 hypotheses. Firstly, climate policy is about more than coping with the challenge of decarbonization. It is, above all, also a question of social justice, global social justice, because climate change is already threatening basic human rights like the right to live, health, food, and water. And most importantly, climate change is posing the biggest threat to those who already have least, the ones who are least responsible for climate change and are least able to protect themselves from its impacts, the ones who have no money to relocate when storms, heat waves, and floods threaten their home again and again, the ones who have no air condition, even though temperatures climb into dangerous level for several months a year, like in India, the ones who cannot buy bottled water when their well produced only salt water, like in Jordan, the ones who starve if their crops dry up, like in Ethiopia, the people of this world whose very lives are under threat from climate change. Protecting the world's climate means, above all, protecting the world's most vulnerable. Climate change mitigation is a question of global social justice. Rich countries like Germany, who have contributed most to climate change, have promised to act in solidarity. But climate protection is not only socially just in itself, it must also be done in a socially just way. Of course, we need to rapidly switch to sustainable energy systems worldwide if we are to stop climate change. But my point is that switch has to benefit everyone who can leave no one, and we can leave no one behind. Reforms like phasing out fossil fuels mean people lose their jobs and their livelihoods. Then they need support and an alternative for the future. And equally, we need to make sure that the new opportunities that are created, like new jobs on decentralized energy supply, benefit above all disadvantaged people. People like Gloria Okamba from Ghana. Gloria is an engineer. She builds these small-scale solar systems so that people in rural areas where there is little infrastructure can light their homes and charge their mobile phones. It is a relatively cheap way of supplying power to regions that often are not otherwise connected up. And it is a source of income for people like Gloria in a country with high unemployment. Gloria can earn some money for herself and her family, and at the same time, she is helping the climate. Those are the kinds of projects we support with German development policy. The aim is to advance what we call a just transition. It is one of my ministry's main focuses. At the Development Ministry, we rely on partnerships for achieving that transition. We want to support people in our partner countries in their efforts to adapt to climate change and become more resilient. And at the same time, to introduce reforms and innovations for more climate neutrality in their own countries. One example is our Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or JETP for short. Germany and other industrialized countries join together in these partnerships with countries in the global south. And together, they are working on the clean energy transition, moving away from fossil fuels to more climate neutral energy sources. So far, we have partnerships with South Africa, Senegal, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And the aim is to use investments in renewable energies to also drive social change. Take, for example, South Africa, where the move away from coal is quite a challenge, both in terms of energy policy and also for society. People who have until now earned their living in the coal industry need to find an alternative. The aim of German development cooperation is to support our partner countries in implementing sustainable structural policies and at the same time creating jobs and social protection. In other words, ensuring that economic change is also socially and ecologically sound. The aim is to slow down climate change and to join together in solidarity to deal with its impact. And that way, climate change doesn't make poverty worse or perpetuate existing inequalities. And we prevent conflicts over already short resources and instead safeguard the world's vital natural resources for everyone. The question of resource distribution brings me to my second hypothesis. Socially just climate policy is also peace policy. Because climate change is shrinking our resources. It is making people vulnerable and threatening their livelihoods. It is bringing great suffering and uncertainty for many people. And it is threatening the social cohesion and the peaceful coexistence of entire societies. Willy Brandt has also underlined that back in the 80s, when he warned that an ever closer connection emerged between the environment and security. And we can see that very clearly how the two are linked if we look, for example, to Africa's Sahel region and the southern edge of the Sahara, at countries like Mali and Niger. Here, the routes used by nomadic herders meet with the sorghum fields of the local farmers. For a long time, these groups exist peacefully, side by side, each making their own living. In fact, they actually profited from each other. But the relationship has been thrown off balance. And a major factor in that has been climate change. There is less and less fertile ground for crops, less grazing land for livestock, less clean water, yet those are resources that both the herders and the farmers desperately need. And so social tension arises. The region is a prime example of how climate change provokes or intensifies distributional conflicts. Because where poverty, political instability, and violent conflicts are rife, people are most vulnerable. And that is fertile ground for other drivers of crises like terrorism. And here we can see the close link between climate and conflict. And that is the picture not only in Sahel, but in many other parts of the world. Climate change is a threat to human security. And that is why climate policy formulated in a spirit of solidarity lays the foundation for more peaceful and stable societies. It does that by protecting people from the increasingly dramatic impact of climate change, by diffusing conflicts over resources, and by ensuring that countries like Germany, who bear some of the responsibility for climate change, deliver on their own responsibility. And that brings me to my third and final hypothesis. Climate policy to be successful, we need more international cooperation, because global challenges call for global solutions. We, as the international community, already have the framework. The Paris Climate Agreement and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals laid out in the 2030 Agenda. They form the basis on which we can join together to tackle climate change and the other major threats to human security, poverty, inequality, and violent conflicts. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, on its most recent report says that the international community is not doing nearly enough to achieve the SDGs and the Paris goals. So where are we falling down? One major stumbling block is the climate finance gap. The needs are immense, not only to finance the reforms needed for climate change mitigation and adaptation, but also to deal with climate-related loss and damage. For example, rebuilding the hospitals, the roads and schools that are destroyed by hurricane, or providing social protection to farmers whose land is unworkable following years of droughts, or developing early warning systems so that people and their livestock can get to safe ground when a flood is coming. The countries of the global south need more funding. Often they are worst hit by climate change, and yet they have fewer resources, and some of them are already heavily in debt. The paradox is that historically, they are least responsible for climate change. Basic human decency dictates that more economically strong countries should make a substantial contribution to international climate finance. But as the major emitters of greenhouse gases, it is also their responsibility. And what is more, it actually benefits them too. I will say more about that later. The industrialized countries have committed to mobilize an annual $100 billion for mitigation and adaptation in low-income countries until 2025, and negotiations are underway on a new goal to apply from 2025. And Germany is contributing its share and will continue to do so, and that is not enough. These funds are channeled, for example, in the Global Shield against climate risks and into a new fund to address loss and damage. The Global Shield was launched jointly by the G7 and the V20, the Vulnerable 20, that is a group of 68 countries under particular threat from climate change. The launch was at the 2020 Climate COP at Sharm el-Sheikh, and since then, the Global Shield has begun work in 8 Pathfinder countries, including Ghana. Social protection systems are being developed there, for example, and linked up with early warning systems. And at the COP in Dubai 2023, another breakthrough in international climate diplomacy was achieved, and a new fund for dealing with loss and damage was created. And low-income countries have long been demanding for this kind of instruments. The United Arab Emirates and Germany made a joint commitment in Dubai of $100 million each. They sent the message that non-traditional donors like the United Arab Emirates were also being called on to support the fund. And yet, despite these achievements, there are still not enough funds to meet all the needs that are there. Added to this, in the fact that public budgets are stretched, that seems to be limiting various countries' political and fiscal scope, not just Germany's. So we need to find new sources of finance to tackle the world's major challenges in the spirit of solidarity. And that is why I support Brazil's proposal for a global billionaires tax. Brazil put forward the proposal under its presidency of the G20, and the idea is that the world's 3,000 or so billionaires should contribute their fair share to funding the common good. But what is fair? To me, it means strong shoulders carrying more than weak ones. But at the moment, the world's super rich are paying far less taxes relative to their wealth than the average of wage workers. One reason is that the support rich do not get their income by earning a wage from doing a job. Instead, they generate income by investing their assets. And investment incomes is taxed differently, usually a lower rate than earned income. So someone who earns a dividend on the share they own often pay less tax than someone who works to earn a wage. And billionaires are often able to structure their wealth so that on paper it generated hardly any tax income. And they make use of the many tax exemptions available. That is all legal, but is it fair? After all, fair are the means applying the same rules for everyone, and I would say. And that is why it is so important to take this issue to multilateral levels and to come up with a global framework. That way, it would be harder for super rich to relocate their wealth to places where it is in effect barely taxed. Brazil's proposal for billionaires to pay a levy of at least 2% of their total wealth, if they had already contributed that amount by paying income tax, then they are exempt. But if they had managed to avoid paying income tax, then they have to pay a billionaire's tax. Is 2% fair? I'm sure that is an open debate, but it would make a huge difference. And since the super rich have a far bigger ecological footprint than average, and we're talking here about comparing an elephant to a mouse, it would be unfair if they didn't make that contribution. I would like to ask you, how high do you think economic losses from extreme weather events were last year? I would like to see your hands again. Who think it was less than $100 billion? $100 billion losses from extreme weather events? 100? Who think it's more? A lot think it's more. More than 200 billion? September thinks more than 200 billion? Well, some of you, yeah. I tell you the answer. It was around $250 billion. And that is the amount that experts estimate could be raised through a global billionaire's tax. And my point is, those are funds that are urgently needed for the global energy transition, for mitigation climate change, and for tackling global inequality. They are funds that can be invested in the future, and that benefits the super rich too. Which brings me back to the benefits I mentioned at the start. When rich countries invest in climate protection in other parts of the world, it also benefits them. To illustrate that, I like to use a concept I'm sure that you all know or will learn about in your studies, the concept of public policy, the concept of public goods. Public goods are a bit like public transport. They're always free riders. In other words, people who are happy to use public transport but don't want to pay for it. And at the same time, and this is the same with global public goods like healthy climate. Of course, the world benefits from Brazil or from Congo preserving the rainforest. Those rainforests are the lungs of our planet. But what countries are actually prepared to pay for the protection of the rainforest? I believe the burden should not rest only with Brazil and Congo. A healthy climate is a global public good, and so it requires global solution. As the biggest development financier, the World Bank plays an important role in that. It provides countries from the global south with funds for investments in the future, and it involves the richer countries in financing them. And as a governor of the World Bank, I joined together with US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to campaign for a root and branch reform of the World Bank. We wanted reforms that would increase the bank's lending volume and also provide additional incentives to channel more funding into global tasks like climate and pandemics. And in other words, projects that don't just benefit one country, but the whole world. These reforms are already well underway. The World Bank has included protection of the climate in its vision. The vision is now a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And now it offers incentives for investments in global public goods like lower interest rates or longer time to repay loans. And these reforms send a strong message of solidarity. And solidarity is exactly what we need more of in international cooperation and for a healthy climate. Willy Brandt said that years ago. He's mostly known for his Ostpolitik, the normalization of relation between West Germany and Eastern Europe beginning in the late 60s, and for his extraordinary talent for using diplomacy to resolve political deadlocks and help those involved to find common ground. His policy of peace and reconciliation gained into the Nobel Prize in 1971, and today his legacy is more relevant than ever with Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine and what seems like even more crises across the world. He was also equally committed to respectful South-North relations based on the spirit of equality. At the invitation of then World Bank President Robert McNamara, Brandt agreed in 1977 to chair the Independent Commission for International Development Issues, also known as the North-South Commission or Brandt Commission. The Commission published 2 reports whose recommendations remain relevant to these days. They called, for example, for the creation of a World Development Fund to tackle poverty, hunger, and inequality. Brandt was certainly opposed to playing off environmental and climate issues against South-North relations. Instead, he described them as 2 dimensions of global domestic policy, which feels responsible for protecting the common interest of all people on this planet, above all an intact environment and a life free of hunger and poverty. And because he believed that was the basis for a stable international peace order, he helped pioneer the concept of global governance. If you read Brandt's writings, you will recognize my 3 hypotheses. Firstly, that climate policy is a question of global social justice. Secondly, that climate policy is peace policy. And thirdly, that climate policy needs more international cooperation. And you will see that none of them are new, and yet they remain highly topically relevant. Development policy is playing a major role in translating these hypotheses into practice and finding solutions in the global challenge of climate change. And before closing, I would like to return to the lemmings in the beginning, those small rodents whose behavior Willy Brandt likened to what humans were doing. Scientists know now the lemmings are not, in fact, driven by collective death wish. It's true that they arrive in large groups at the sea, but not to drown themselves. They do it because they have large population booms every 4 years, and they know that they need to find them somewhere else to live. So they may try to get across the water. Lemmings are good swimmers. Many of them do actually make it. So the species has, on the whole, actually developed a very effective strategy for survival. But I'm telling you all this because I believe we have grounds for hope. Despite the massive challenges posed by climate change, despite all the damage and destruction that is already causing, because at the last climate COP in Dubai, we proved that the international community is capable of joining forces to address climate change. Yes, it will be hard. Yes, it is the biggest challenge facing humankind, The stakes could not be higher. It won't be easy, but I remain optimistic. I have to be optimistic, we all have to do, because I agree with the philosopher Karl Popper when he said, optimism is a duty. So thank you for your attention.